The base woke up slowly that morning, the way it always did before a training day, with the sound of boots on gravel and coffee machines hissing in the mess hall. Nobody paid much attention to the woman who arrived just after dawn, carrying a single duffel bag and a set of orders that had been signed by someone none of the clerks recognized. She did not introduce herself at the gate. She simply handed over her papers, waited while the guard checked them twice, and walked through without a word. By the time she reached the administrative building, a rumor had already started. Someone said she was a liaison from another branch. Someone else said she was there to observe the training program for a report that would never be published. Nobody knew for certain, and she did nothing to clear up the confusion. She only asked for directions to the range and said she needed to report there by 5 in the morning the next day. Master Chief Daniels read her transfer orders twice before he believed them. He had been running this training program for 11 years, and in all that time, he had never seen an order quite like this one. It granted her full access to the live fire qualification course, the same course his candidates spent 6 brutal weeks preparing for. It did not explain why. It did not explain who had approved it. It simply said she was to be given whatever she required, and that questions about her presence were not to be raised with her superiors. Daniels was not a man who liked mysteries, but he had learned long ago that some orders were not meant to be questioned, only followed. He folded the papers, put them in his desk drawer, and went to inform his training officers that they would have an observer joining them the next morning. The candidates noticed her before anyone told them who she was. 214 men, all of them exhausted from weeks of training that had already broken a third of their original class, sat in the mess hall that evening and watched a stranger eat alone at the far end of the room. She did not speak to anyone. She did not look up when they whispered about her. By the time dinner ended, she had already earned a nickname. They started calling her the Ghost, half as a joke, and half because nobody could explain why she was there. One of the younger candidates, a man named Ortiz, who had been near the top of his class since the first week, tried to strike up a conversation with her near the door. He asked if she was joining their unit. She looked at him for a moment, said nothing, and walked past him into the cold night air. Ortiz returned to his table red-faced, and the others laughed, but underneath the laughter was a growing curiosity that none of them could shake. That night, most of the candidates slept poorly, the way they always did before a big test, but for the first time in weeks, their nervous energy was not only about the course ahead of them, it was about her too. Rumors spread through the barracks like fire through dry grass. Some said she was a retired operator sent to test the range itself. Others said she was some kind of legendary shooter whose name had been erased from every record for reasons nobody could imagine. Nobody slept well that night, and by the time the sun rose over the range, the entire base was buzzing with anticipation. The range itself was a brutal stretch of land, carved out of hills and scrub brush, with targets set at distances ranging from 300 meters to well over 1,000. It was widely regarded as the hardest shooting course in the entire training program. Even the best candidates rarely cleared more than 6 or 7 targets out of 9, and only under perfect conditions. The targets were staggered unpredictably, some stationary, some moving, and each one appeared for only a few seconds before disappearing again. Wind, heat, and fatigue all played their part in making the course nearly impossible to master. Daniels arrived early that morning to find her already waiting near the firing line, her rifle case resting beside her, untouched. She said nothing as he approached, only nodded once when he explained the safety protocols, as though she already knew them by heart. He offered her a spotter, she declined. He offered her extra time to prepare, she said she needed 5 minutes, no more. Word had already spread through the training company by the time the sun cleared the hills, and by 6 in the morning, the bleachers above the range were filled. 214 men, all of them among the best shooters the country had to offer, filed in to watch what they assumed would be nothing more than an unusual formality. None of them expected to see anything remarkable. Most of them expected to watch a stranger fail, and some, if they were honest with themselves, were hoping for exactly that. It would have made the mystery around her feel smaller, easier to explain away. She opened her rifle case at exactly 5 minutes before the hour, assembled her weapon with quiet efficiency, and checked the wind flags along the range without a word to anyone. Daniels watched her from the observation post, arms crossed, unsure what to expect. He had seen thousands of candidates step onto this range over the years, He had seen champions, and he had seen men who broke down halfway through the course, overwhelmed by the pressure of trying to prove themselves in front of their peers. Something about the calm in her posture told him this would be different, though he could not have said exactly why. When the first target rose from the brush at 300 meters, she fired before most of the men in the bleachers even registered the movement. The target dropped instantly, and a low murmur ran through the crowd. It was a good shot, but not an impossible one. Plenty of candidates could make that shot on a calm day. The second target appeared at 500 meters, partially obscured by a ridge of rock, visible for only a few seconds. She fired once, and it fell just as quickly as the first. The murmur in the bleachers grew louder. Ortiz, sitting near the front row, leaned forward without realizing it, his earlier embarrassment forgotten entirely. By the time the third and fourth targets fell, whispers had turned into stunned silence. The fourth target had been a moving silhouette at 900 meters, one of the hardest shots on the entire course, one that required the shooter to calculate not only distance and wind, but the speed of the target itself. Most candidates who attempted it either missed entirely or wasted several precious seconds adjusting their aim, time they did not have. She led the target by a margin that made the range safety officer glance down at his equipment twice, as though he did not quite believe what he had just seen. Daniels felt something tighten in his chest as he watched. In 11 years of running this program, he had seen exactly 2 candidates clear the moving target on their first attempt. He had never seen anyone do it with such little visible effort. The fifth and sixth targets fell in quick succession, each shot fired with the same unhurried rhythm, as though she were working through a routine she had practiced 1,000 times before. There was no hesitation in her movements, no wasted motion between shots. She breathed evenly, adjusted for the wind with barely perceptible shifts of her body, and fired only when she was certain of the result. By the 7th target, the bleachers had gone completely silent. This was the shot that broke most candidates, a target positioned behind a barrier that required the shooter to physically move to a new firing position within a strict time limit. Most candidates, faced with the impossible math of the challenge, simply gave up on the shot entirely and accepted the penalty, hoping to make up for it elsewhere on the course. She did not hesitate. She shifted her position smoothly, settled into her new stance, and fired within the time limit, dropping the 7th target cleanly. Daniels realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to breathe normally again. Around him, the training officers had gone quiet, watching the scene below with the same stunned expressions worn by the candidates in the bleachers. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to break whatever strange spell had settled over the range. The 8th target appeared at just past 1,000 meters, a distance that pushed the very limits of the rifle she was using. She took a moment longer this time, adjusting for the increased distance, reading the wind flags one final time before settling into her final breath. When she fired, the target dropped instantly, and a few of the younger candidates in the bleachers actually gasped aloud, unable to contain themselves any longer. Only one target remained. The 9th and final target was the hardest of them all, set at nearly 1,200 meters, moving unpredictably behind a natural barrier of rock and brush. It was, by design, nearly impossible to hit within the time allowed. In the history of the course, only a handful of candidates had ever managed it, and even then, only under perfect conditions, with a skilled spotter calling adjustments. She had no spotter. She had refused one from the very beginning. She took longer on this final shot than she had on any other, though to the men watching, the pause felt like it lasted an eternity. The range fell into a silence so complete that some of the candidates later swore they could hear their own heartbeats. Daniels found himself gripping the railing of the observation post without realizing he had moved. When she finally fired, the sound of the shot cracked across the range, and for a moment, nobody was certain what had happened. Then, far in the distance, the 9th target dropped. 9 for 9, under regulation time, with rounds to spare. For a long moment, nobody in the bleachers moved. 214 men, all of them among the most skilled shooters the country had ever trained, sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. It was not simply that she had cleared the course, it was the manner in which she had done it, with a calm precision that made the impossible look almost effortless. Then, somewhere in the middle of the bleachers, Someone began to clap. It started slowly, uncertainly, as though nobody wanted to be the first to break the silence entirely. But it spread quickly, row by row, until the entire range erupted into applause. Men who had spent weeks competing against each other for the top spot in their class stood together, clapping for a stranger whose name they still did not know. She did not turn to acknowledge them. She broke down her rifle with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all morning, packed it carefully into its case, and walked off the firing line without a single word. Daniels moved to intercept her before she reached the gate, uncertain what he even wanted to say. He settled on the only question that felt important enough to ask. He asked her name. She paused for a moment, looking at him with an expression that was neither cold nor friendly, simply unreadable. Then she said that some names were not meant to be remembered, only the lessons behind them. She thanked him for the use of his range, and before he could respond, she was walking toward the gate, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, disappearing into the morning light, exactly the way she had arrived. By nightfall, she was gone from the base entirely. The transfer orders that had brought her there were never explained, and when Daniels tried to trace them through official channels in the following weeks, he found himself met with silence at every turn, as though the paperwork itself had never existed. Nobody could confirm who she was, which branch she belonged to, or why she had been sent to test a course that had nothing to do with her official assignment, whatever that assignment might have been. The candidates talked about her for years afterward, the story growing a little with each retelling, though the core of it never changed. Ortiz, who went on to become an instructor himself, told the story to every new class that came through the program, always ending with the same words Daniels had once told him. The best shot anyone on that base had ever seen had not needed anyone to know who she was. Daniels kept her scorecard in his desk drawer, long after he retired from the program, tucked beneath a stack of old paperwork he never quite found the courage to throw away. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would take it out and look at it again, tracing the 9 marks across the page with his finger, remembering the silence that had fallen over 214 men the moment the final target dropped. He never learned her name. In time, he stopped expecting to. What stayed with him instead was the lesson she had left behind without ever meaning to teach it, that true skill did not need an audience to prove itself, and that sometimes the most remarkable people were the ones who asked for nothing in return, not recognition, not applause, not even a name remembered. The story of the woman nobody knew became something of a legend on that base, passed down from one class of candidates to the next, each retelling adding a little more color to the details that nobody could ever quite confirm. But the heart of it remained exactly as it happened that morning on the range, when a stranger with no name and no explanation stepped onto the hardest course in the program and reminded 214 of the best shooters in the country that mastery, real mastery, rarely announces itself. It simply arrives, does what needs to be done, and disappears again into the quiet it came from.